Hi everyone, welcome to part 1 of the Early Republic. Your questions to think about here: what was the strange outcome of the presidential election of 1796? How did this happen? Why did the Federalists support the passage of the Sedition Act? What was the Democratic-Republican response to it? In September 1796, President Washington published his famed farewell address, which formally announced his intention to retire from the presidency. The leading members of the Federalist Party agreed that John Adams should be their candidate against the Democratic-Republican Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Pinckney was the party's choice for vice president. But Alexander Hamilton feared that an independent-minded John Adams would be difficult for him to manipulate. So Hamilton exploited an awkward feature of the Electoral College. In accordance with the Constitution, each elector cast 2 ballots, and the person who gained the most votes became the president. The runner-up, regardless of party affiliation, served as vice president. Hamilton secretly urged Southern Federalists to support only Pinckney, even if that meant throwing away an elector's second vote. But when New Englanders loyal to Adams heard of Hamilton's maneuvering, they dropped Pinckney. When the votes were counted, Adams had 71, Jefferson had 68, and Thomas Pinckney had 59, which means that John Adams, the Federalist, became the President of the United States, and his rival, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic-Republican, became the vice president. Foreign affairs immediately occupied President Adams's full attention. Relations between the United States and France had been steadily deteriorating because of the French Revolution. In 1797, French privateers began seizing American ships. Since neither the United States nor France officially declared war, the hostilities became known as the Quasi-War. Some within American society, including the Hamiltonian branch of the Federalists and, of course, the Democratic Republicans, urged President Adams to stand up to France and to protect the honor of the United States. But President Adams was concerned that the United States was not strong enough militarily to meet France on the battlefield, even if that battlefield took place on the high seas. So instead, President Adams is going to send a negotiating team to Paris to meet with the French foreign minister to discuss a possible peaceful outcome to the situation. But when the team arrived in Paris, they were met by 3 obscure intermediaries who told them that in order to meet with the French foreign minister, they would have to pay a hefty bribe, $250,000. In 1797, that's a lot of money. The American negotiators, of course, said no and sent a report back to President Adams explaining the situation. But when President Adams informed Congress of the situation, he changed the names of the 3 Frenchmen to Messieurs X, Y, and Z. And so this becomes known as the XYZ affair. And it inflames the Hamiltonian faction and the Democratic Republicans to call for war. They call this an insult to American honor and that President Adams needs to stand up to France. During the summer of 1798, the Federalist majority in Congress passed a group of bills known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. I want to focus exclusively here on the Sedition Act, because this legislation authorized the use of federal courts and the powers of the presidency to silence the Democratic-Republican opposition. Here's the situation. President Adams and the Federalists were facing very vocal, even hostile criticism from the Democratic Republicans, especially the Democratic Republican newspapers. Much like today, media sources, especially newspapers, have a political bias. And back in the late 18th century, the Democratic Republican newspapers were vicious in their attacks of President Adams and the Federalists for not standing up to France. They really believed that President Adams was not doing enough to protect American honor. And so these newspapers were just vicious. And the problem was that the Federalists and ultimately President Adams believed that what these newspapers were publishing was so vile that it constituted, or at least bordered on, treason, and that the Democratic Republican newspapers were trying to essentially incite a riot or rebellion or treason. And so they believed that the Sedition Act was necessary to shut down this dangerous opposition. But when you take a look at the Sedition Act, making criticizing the government a crime, this very clearly violates the First Amendment to the Constitution. But the problem was, what do we do about it? So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the two leading Democratic Republicans, in the fall of 1798, they were convinced that the Federalists were trying to destroy the country. And as the crisis deepened, Jefferson and Madison drafted separate protests known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Both statements vigorously defended the right of individual state assemblies to interpret the constitutionality of federal law. In the Kentucky Resolution, Jefferson described the federal union as a compact. The states had transferred certain powers to the national government, but, he argued, they retained full authority over all matters not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So here we get to this idea of the compact theory of government, and it brings us all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. So in that very last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it says, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." It's plural. And that as free and independent states, plural, they have the right to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances. So what we concluded from that paragraph is essentially each one of these colonies is declaring themselves to be independent of Great Britain. But the way that it's worded is that it implies that each of these colonies is now an independent nation. That is fixed by the Articles of Confederation. But within the Articles of Confederation, the states are still described as sovereign. So this implies that there's still very much an independent nature to the states. And that is why we described the Confederation government as kind of an alliance, like almost like the United Nations, where these independent nations are working together for the common good, but essentially taking care of their own affairs internally. When we ratify the Constitution, Jefferson and Madison and others who believed in the compact theory of government are going to argue that the states entered into an agreement or compact, a contract that bound them together, but that it set certain conditions, that the national government is in charge of a certain realm, and when they go above and beyond their purview, their limitations, then it's really up to the states to keep that national government in check. So what this implies, although Jefferson doesn't state it overtly, is that a state could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional if they believed that Congress was stepping outside of the bounds of the contract. We are going to continuously talk about the compact theory of government through the rest of our lessons. So coming back to our questions to think about, what was the strange outcome of the presidential election of 1796? How did this happen? The outcome was that John Adams, the Federalist, became the president, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, became the vice president. So two men of two different political parties being the president and the vice president. How did this happen? It happens because of Alexander Hamilton. He was trying to scheme behind the scenes in order to make Thomas Pinckney the president of the United States, but he fails when New Englanders discover his plot. And so John Adams wins the most electoral college votes, making him the president, and Thomas Jefferson, rather than Thomas Pinckney, wins the second most electoral college votes. Why did the Federalists support the passage of the Sedition Act? The Federalists believed that the Democratic Republican newspapers were out of line, that their vicious attacks of the Federalists and the Adams administration bordered on treason, and that if they weren't shut down, they could possibly incite a riot or a rebellion. And then what was the Democratic-Republican response to it? Thomas Jefferson writes the Kentucky Resolution, and James Madison writes the Virginia Resolution. And in these two statements, both men declare essentially that the states have created the national government, that by joining in this compact, which is the Constitution, that they have given the national government certain powers, but not all powers. And that if the federal government or the Congress steps outside of the boundaries of this contract, the Constitution, then it's up to the states to make that known and to do something about it. So stay tuned for part 2 of the early republic.